Good evening, everyone. Tonight, we turn our gaze to one of the most unsettling criminal cases in Soviet-era history, Anatoly Slivko, a man whose outward persona as a devoted youth mentor belayed a darkness few could have imagined. Operating primarily in the 1960s and 1970s, Slivko was no mere delinquent. He was a carefully organized, methodical killer. Yet, he was also a respected figure in his community, known for running popular youth clubs and excursions. That stark contrast between public persona and secret brutality would later horrify investigators, families, and the public at large. For years, the disappearances of teenage boys in the small city of Nevinomsk were overshadowed by a myriad of societal troubles, economic challenges, bureaucratic inefficiencies, and a general reluctance to believe that such a monstrous predator could live among them. Slivko, possessing a deceptive charm, meticulously drew in his victims with promises of camaraderie and adventure. By the time the authorities recognized the pattern, multiple lives had been tragically cut short. In the pages ahead, we will explore Slivko's life story, examine the horrifying path he took, and revisit the complex police investigation that ultimately led to his capture. Prepare for a journey into a case that still resonates as a cautionary tale of deception and betrayal, one that reveals just how fragile the line can be between altruism and unspeakable evil. Part 2: The Crime Journey, Seeds of Obsession, Early Life and Family Influences. Anatoly Slivko was born on December 28, 1938, in the Soviet Union Stavropol Krai, a region known for its agricultural landscapes and relatively modest industrialization. His family situation was neither uniquely tragic nor especially nurturing. Like many Soviet households of the period, they faced economic constraints, rationing, and a culture of strict discipline. These conditions might not automatically birth a serial offender, but they provided the backdrop against which Anatoly's character began to take shape. From a young age, he displayed an unusual fascination with control and authority. Childhood friends and what few he had later recalled that Anatoly often orchestrated elaborate role-playing games, always casting himself as the one in charge: the teacher, the military officer, or the policeman. While such behaviors in isolation might be innocuous, hints of deeper psychological tensions occasionally surfaced. Teachers noted he had difficulty empathizing with classmates, frequently showing impatience or hostility toward those who disobeyed his rules during play. His family life was similarly marked by a rigid hierarchy. His father, employed in a local agricultural enterprise, expected near military obedience. Anatoly's mother reinforced these standards, emphasizing respect for authority and the importance of social propriety. Some relatives suspected that Anatoly internalized these lessons to an extreme degree, clinging to rigid structures in a way that left little room for normal adolescent exploration. Yet, paradoxically, Slivko developed a fascination with youth groups and the communal spirit they promised. By his teenage years, he was already volunteering at community centers, organizing small clubs, leading outdoor activities, and assisting in public celebrations. From the outside, it appeared that Anatoly had found his calling. Unbeknownst to everyone around him, these youthful pursuits would become the very stage upon which his deviant urges played out. Formative incidents, 2 incidents from Anatoly's adolescence, stand out in retrospect. The first involved a near-fatal prank where Anatoly convinced a younger boy to partake in a mock execution scenario, tying him up in a barn. While the child survived, the situation terrified him to the point of tears. Anatoly seemed equally frightened when adults discovered them, more fearful of punishment than regretful about the boy's distress. Nevertheless, the episode did not lead to formal repercussions beyond a stern talking to from family elders. The second incident, recounted by one of Anatoly's cousins, involved his secret stash of notebooks filled with meticulously drawn scenes of hanging or other forms of staged death. The drawings were disturbingly detailed, featuring teenage boys in precarious positions. When confronted, Anatoly merely mumbled vague excuses about morbid curiosity and harmless fantasies. Family members, largely unversed in child psychology, dismissed it as a passing oddity. No one pressed further, a decision that would later haunt them. Soviet youth culture and the birth of Charged. To fully understand Slivko's trajectory, we must appreciate the allure of Soviet youth clubs. During the 1960s, the Komsomol, High Communist Union of Youth, and pioneer movements were at their zenith. Across the nation, children and adolescents participated in organized activities designed to instill patriotism, discipline, and collective spirit. Summer camps, hiking expeditions, and sports clubs were central to this culture, offering an alternative to aimless street life. Anatoly Slivko, now in his early 20s, gravitated toward these movements. By all appearances, he was an ideal mentor, diligent, polite, and enthusiastic about shaping the next generation. He leveraged local connections to establish a youth club called Charged, primarily aimed at boys aged 12 to 16. The club gained quick popularity in Nevanism. Parents found solace in the fact that their children were spending time in a structured environment rather than roaming the streets. Supervising older youths and forging relationships with local authorities, Slivko deftly cultivated an aura of respectability. Club activities and reputation. Charged's activities included camping trips, physical fitness challenges, parades, and group discussions about Soviet ideology. Slivko was meticulous in planning these excursions, creating detailed itineraries and ensuring members adhered to strict discipline. At local events, the boys marched in formation, demonstrating unwavering loyalty to their club leader. This dedication did not go unnoticed. The local press occasionally featured Charged for its achievements, praising the club for inspiring the youth to develop strong moral character and patriotism. Slivko received commendations from municipal committees, further elevating his standing. However, behind the scenes, anomalies surfaced. Some parents reported that their sons returned from certain outings withdrawn or anxious. When confronted, Slivko would calmly explain that the child might have been overwhelmed by the physical challenges or upset by a typical teenage spat. Given his sterling reputation, most parents took his words at face value. Hidden urges, the genesis of Slivko's deviant fantasies, beneath the polished veneer of community service. Anatoly nurtured dark sexual and psychological desires. The seeds of his obsessions, possibly sown during adolescence, began to flourish in the structured environment of Charged. He discovered that orchestrating physically strenuous activities, like mock rescue drills or staged accidents, aroused in him a blend of fascination and power. The nature of his fetish decades after his crimes came to light, forensic psychologists speculated that Slivko suffered from a paraphilia centered around the simulation of hanging and asphyxiation. He appeared fixated on the moment between life and death, deriving a perverse thrill from controlling that boundary for his victims. In the Soviet Union of that era, discussions of sexual pathologies remained largely taboo, leaving Slivko's deviance concealed by ignorance and social stigma. He began experimenting, first in small ways that remained nearly undetectable to outsiders. For instance, Slivko would select a boy from the club, often one who trusted him, and propose a peculiar challenge that involved partial strangulation under the guise of building resilience or simulating a life-threatening scenario to test emergency response, claiming to have medical knowledge or citing official safety training. He manipulated these adolescents into cooperating. Many of these sessions involved Slivko filming or photographing the events. The amateur footage depicted the boys unconscious or on the brink of losing consciousness. Each time, Slivko revived them, ensuring no permanent harm was done, at least in the beginning. The boys, unaware of the danger, were often told it was part of a secret test for advanced club members or a heroic reenactment of a historical scenario. These manipulations illustrate the disturbing blend of exploitation and twisted mentorship at the core of Slivko's crimes. A cautious predator, ensuring loyalty and secrecy. One of Slivko's most unsettling traits was his calculated methodology. He recognized that his deviant experiments could expose him if even one victim disclosed the truth. To mitigate this risk, he built an atmosphere of cult-like loyalty within charging. He praised the boys who partook in his special trainings, portraying them as elite members worthy of hidden knowledge or accolades. Additionally, he nurtured personal bonds with each team. Gifts such as prized Soviet-era badges, sports equipment, or opportunities to serve as assistant leaders on club outings served to reinforce gratitude and silence. Some parents noted the unusual level of favoritism, but dismissed it as Slivko's attempt to reward good behavior. Gaslighting and guilt, a hallmark of Slivko's psychological manipulation, was a subtle form of gaslighting. After a near asphyxiation session, a boy might wake up disoriented, recalling hazy images. Nothing. Slivko would downplay the gravity, telling the child that he merely fainted from overexertion or oxygen deprivation in a controlled drill. He praised the boy's bravery for enduring the test, sometimes even giving him a special patch to wear on his uniform. Over time, nothing. This praise built a perverse sense of pride that discouraged the boys from viewing themselves as victims. He further instilled guilt by warning them that any mention of the training outside the club would sabotage their entire group's reputation. In the Soviet context, being labeled a troublemaker could harm a teen's future prospects. Slivko exploited these fears effectively. Slowly but surely, he tested boundaries, tightening the noose, literally and figuratively, until he was ready to progress to more lethal ends. Inching toward murder, the first documented case, investigators would later conclude that the first boy Slivko killed likely died around the mid-1960s during one of these experiments. However, the exact date and identity remain ambiguous, as it took years for authorities to trace the chain of events. All that is known is that a teenager from Churchit did not return home from a hike and was reported missing. The local police, preoccupied with other matters, dismissed it as a runaway case. Testimonies from club members varied. Some said the boy left partway through an excursion, others claimed never to have seen him that day. In reality, the fatal incident appears to have begun as a standard asphyxiation ritual, one Slivko believed he could manage and reverse as he had done before. This time, though the procedure went too far, the boy did not regain consciousness. Panicking, Slivko quickly resorted to disposing of the body. Through a combination of cunning and luck, he evaded immediate suspicion. Soviet bureaucracies often failed to track missing teenagers thoroughly, especially if families lacked influence. A haunting turning point, the effect of this first death on Slivko's psyche can only be speculated. Some experts argue he experienced a rush of power that emboldened him to continue. Others believe he felt genuine fear, but also discovered a dark compulsion he could no longer control. Either way, the incident solidified his status as a cautious predator, someone who'd meticulously refine his methods to avoid detection. Interestingly, he did not lash out indiscriminately after this. He spent periods lying low, possibly to ensure that no suspicious eyes turned his way. Whenever a rumor circulated about the missing teen, Slivko would feign deep concern, even helping to coordinate search efforts. The brazenness of this act further solidified his facade of a caring mentor. The intersection of medical curiosity and sadism One peculiar aspect of Slivko's behavior was his pseudo-medical rationalizations. He appeared to harbor a fascination with the physical processes of strangulation and revival, even claiming in later confessions that he was driven by a scientific curiosity to test human limits. Such claims might seem absurd, yet they helped him maintain a sense of self-justification. He scoured medical textbooks, focusing on chapters about hypoxia, oxygen deprivation, and resuscitation techniques. While rudimentary, his knowledge enabled him to push boundaries without immediately killing his victims. Over time, however, these forced near-death experiences caused permanent damage, both physically and psychologically, to the boys subjected to them, compounding risk. As Slivko successfully carried out multiple sessions without being caught, he developed greater confidence. He recorded extensive notes about how long a victim could remain unconscious before revival became impossible. These experiments bore no scientific merit, but he meticulously documented them for his own perverse gratification. Some accounts suggest he measured the boys' pulses, respiration rates, and muscle reactions, translating the data into charts. In parallel, he refined techniques to hush victims. He recognized that a single survivor reporting the details to authorities could derail everything. As a result, he expanded his arsenal of manipulative tactics, threatening to expel them from the club, warning of dire consequences for their families, and, in some instances, offering hush money or special privileges. Over time, his skill at ensuring silence became as chilling as the acts themselves. The Soviet context. How Slivko operated unnoticed. It's crucial to situate Slivko's crimes in the broader environment of the late Soviet era. The rigid social and political structure both aided and abetted his secrecy. Several factors stand out: bureaucratic inefficiency. Missing person reports were shuffled through multiple offices, often leading to confusion or misplacement of crucial documents. This disorganization allowed Slivko to exploit knowledge gaps between local and regional agencies. Public trust in organized youth activities. Turgid was viewed as a patriotic microcosm. Parents and authorities alike had little reason to suspect something nefarious behind the wholesome facade of hikes and community service. Cultural taboos around sexual deviance. The Soviet Union rarely addressed sexual crimes openly, especially those involving minors. The fear of scandal and the stigma of homosexuality or fetishistic behavior led many to avoid prying too deeply. Inconsistent policing. While the Soviet system could be draconian in political matters, local policing for common crimes varied widely in quality. A single police officer might handle everything from petty theft to homicide investigations, leaving them ill prepared for a cunning serial offender. These elements combined to create the perfect storm for Slivko's spree. He continued orchestrating risky experiments, filming or photographing many of them, all while retaining his image as an exemplary youth leader. Escalation. The count of victims rises as the 1970s progressed. An unsettling pattern of disappearances haunted Nevinomisk. The official toll would eventually number 7 boys, but there is speculation the true figure could be higher. Slivko, emboldened by prior successes, refined his approach with each incident isolation. He picked victims from families less likely to demand immediate, aggressive investigations, often those without strong local connections or who were struggling financially. Routine and feigning normalcy. He structured outings so that a boy could be separated from the group for a private training session. He might claim they were scouting a future route for a hiker testing advanced first aid skills. Overconfidence. As time went on, Slivko took bigger risks. He orchestrated elaborate sessions with extended periods of partial asphyxiation. In many cases, the boys remained unconscious for dangerously long durations, leading to reversible harm or death. Between each murder, Slivko maintained a semblance of calm, continuing daily activities at Chargit, attending community events, and occasionally even assisting in official searches for missing youths. This duplicity stunned authorities once they finally uncovered the truth. Lingering suspicion, some local parents began comparing notes about their missing sons. A handful approached the police, alleging that the last time their child was seen alive was near Church's base. Yet Slivko skillfully deflected suspicion by producing alibis. He was with other club members, or he had official responsibilities at the time of the disappearance. The lack of conclusive forensic evidence allowed him to evade arrest, though murmurs of doubt grew louder. For those who tried to speak openly, the Soviet environment posed its own barriers. Fear of reprisal from local bureaucrats, concern about being labeled a traitor, and an ingrained belief that the state was both infallible and indifferent to personal tragedies. Slivko thrived in these shadows, orchestrating his horrifying crimes with methodical precision. Attempts at confession and internal turmoil, a curious phenomenon, emerged amid Slivko's atrocities. Occasional hints that he grappled with guilt, or at least fear of the moral ramifications. According to some who later encountered him, he suffered from nightmares, appearing shaken and deeply disturbed. Whether this was genuine remorse or anxiety about being caught is debatable. Subtle outreach for psychological help? At one point, anecdotal accounts suggest Slivko visited a local psychotherapist under the guise of stress. The session notes, if they ever existed, remained private due to Soviet confidentiality rules. Some claim he vaguely alluded to deviant urges, though he never admitted to actual crimes. The therapist reportedly offered standard advice: medication for anxiety, encouragement to reduce work-related stress. No further action was taken. Slivko also occasionally confided in close associates that he was troubled by the emotional toll of youth leadership, explaining away his turmoil as a side effect of heavy responsibility. He continued to mask the deeper, horrific truth. This half-hearted search for solace underscores the internal tension that can plague even the most calculating offenders, an awareness that their acts exist in stark violation of societal norms. Toward the brink, the last years before exposure, as the 1970s drew to a close, Slivko's luck began to fray. The number of missing teens in and around Nevenomyssk was becoming conspicuous. While law enforcement remained disorganized, new officers with fresh perspectives arrived, less encumbered by the entrenched assumption that the youth club was beyond suspicion. Several near misses rattled Slivko. In one instance, a boy almost escaped mid-experiment, regaining consciousness sooner than expected and fleeing half-dressed into the woods. Slivko managed to catch and calm him, employing manipulative reassurances. The incident, however, spurred him to tighten security, potentially discarding any illusions that he could keep testing fate indefinitely. Inside Chargit, subtle rifts formed as well. Older teens moved on or expressed disillusionment, though few dared to articulate the real reasons. Fear, shame, and the manipulative loyalty cultivated by Slivko kept them from exposing his practices. It was a fragile balance, nothing teetering on the edge of exposure. In the next phase of our journey, we will see how that tenuous balance finally collapsed, leading to the unraveling of one of the Soviet era's most shocking serial murder cases. Part 3, the process of capturing criminal, mounting suspicion community whispers. By the early 1980s, the trickle of rumors about Church's mysterious leader turned into a steady murmur. While Slivko maintained a devoted following among many parents and local officials, an undercurrent of doubt tugged at the community's conscience. Some families, plagued by unresolved disappearances, began comparing notes more openly. A local teacher, noticing consistent patterns in the backgrounds and ages of the missing boys, grew alarmed enough to confront law enforcement directly. At first, the police showed reluctance. Slivko's outward standing as a decorated organizer of youth events made him an unlikely suspect in their eyes. Many officers had personal interactions with him. He was often present at official parades or civil ceremonies, always volunteering to help. Such a person, they reasoned, could not possibly be a murderer. Initial police inquiries, despite these biases, the seeds of doubt took root. Two relatively junior detectives, Vladimir K. and Sergei A., decided to open a discreet investigation, starting with a review of missing persons cases that dated back more than a decade. They found that an unusual number of them linked to boys from Charged or youths who had at least some interaction with the club. When they attempted to interview families, they encountered varied reactions. Some cooperated fully, desperate for answers. Others distrusted the police, fearing retribution or convinced that the state had no interest in smaller communities. Nonetheless, these initial interviews yielded enough anecdotal evidence to warrant deeper scrutiny, particularly because the timeline consistently intersected with Slivko's presence in the area. Breakthrough clue, a survivor's account. The investigation took a decisive turn when the detectives stumbled upon a now adult man, Igor P., who had once been part of Charged. Igor confided that, as a teenager, he'd experienced an unsettling incident under Slivko's supervision. Blacking out during a staged emergency drill, only to awaken in a state of partial undress. With Slivko administering CPR, Igor recalled feeling a profound sense of dread, though Slivko assured him it was just a mishap. This revelation sent shockwaves through the detective team. Nothing. Igor's story hinted at a pattern of forced asphyxiation and possible sexual undertones. Even more troubling was that Igor admitted Slivko had threatened him, warning that any disclosure would ruin Igor's life and cast shame on his family. For years, Igor had kept silent out of fear and confusion. Corroboration from other victims, encouraged by Igor's bravery, the detectives reached out to a few other former club members who had either left Nevinnomyssk or distanced themselves from Slivko in adulthood. One described a similar near-death episode, though he, too, had been manipulated to believing it was an accident. Another mentioned a rumor that some of the younger boys had disappeared after special training sessions. But no one dared to speak up because Slivko was so respected. The consistency in these accounts bolstered the detectives' conviction that they were on the right track. By now, the gravity of the allegations was impossible to ignore. They needed tangible evidence, preferably physical, to link Slivko definitively to the missing boys. Tensions with higher-ups and the reluctance to act. Despite the compelling testimony, nothing. The detectives encountered stiff resistance from their superiors. Senior officers, who had known Slivko for years, scoffed at the idea that a pillar of the community could be a serial murderer. Some insinuated that the younger detectives were chasing a wild goose, perhaps out of ambition or a desire to sensationalize the case. Political overtones. The Soviet hierarchy placed immense value on maintaining appearances, particularly regarding youth activities and community morale. Admitting that a high-profile youth leader could be a killer threatened not only the local administration's credibility, but also the broader narrative of Soviet ideals. Consequently, calls for a formal investigation into Slivko were met with warnings to proceed cautiously, if at all. Nonetheless, the detective duo persisted. They quietly followed Slivko's activities, noting the times and dates he held private club sessions. They discreetly contacted families of recently missing children to see if any had ties to Charged. Though forced to operate under the radar, their conviction grew with each new piece of information. A fortuitous chance. Finding hidden film footage, a stroke of luck arrived when one of the detectives received a tip about a peculiar item at a local pawn shop. An individual had tried to sell what appeared to be old camera equipment and film reels. The transaction never completed due to pricing disputes, but the conversation intrigued the pawn shop owner. He mentioned the attempted sale to an acquaintance who happened to have heard rumors about the ongoing investigation into youth disappearances. Upon retrieving the reels, nothing. The detective team discovered they were unlabeled and in poor condition, but they recognized the possibility that these could be related to Slivko. He was known to film many of his club's activities. They requisitioned the equipment and had the reels developed, hoping to uncover anything that might link Charged to the vanishings. Disturbing revelations on film. What they found was beyond disturbing. The footage depicted teenage boys being partially hanged, losing consciousness, and, in some frames, being subjected to explicit acts that hinted at sexual motivation. Although the faces in the reels were sometimes obscured, the setting appeared to be forested areas or secluded spots that resembled known Charged camping sites. While the reels did not explicitly show a murder, they contained enough incriminating material to warrant immediate action. Investigators identified Slivko's voice in some segments, instructing the boys on what to do. The presence of these images shattered any lingering doubts that the man behind Charged was committing heinous crimes. Armed with graphic audiovisual proof, the detectives felt they finally had the ammunition to push for an official arrest warrant, escalating the case. Mobilizing law enforcement, the discovery of these reels catapulted the investigation into high gear. Even the most skeptical officials could no longer dismiss the possibility of Slivko's guilt. A special unit was formed under the auspices of the local Ministry of Internal Affairs, tasked with building a robust case. They needed evidence that linked the man on the film to specific victims, and, crucially, established that those victims never returned home. Coordinating with forensic experts, forensic specialists scoured the footage frame by frame. They noted landmarks, bits of clothing, or equipment that might tie the scenes to known missing persons. Simultaneously, criminal psychologists were enlisted to profile Slivko, exploring how someone with such a facade could commit these acts repeatedly without detection. However, a key challenge remained: bodies. To press murder charges in the Soviet legal system, physical evidence of homicide was paramount. The disappearance of a person alone might suffice for an investigation, but a conviction often required hard proof, such as remains. Thus, the task force faced the monumental challenge of determining whether Slivko had hidden or destroyed the remains of those he killed, and where. The raid on Charged headquarters in May 1985. The investigative team, armed with search warrants, descended upon the Charged Club premises and Slivko's personal residence. The operation involved plainclothes officers to minimize public alarm. They meticulously combed through every inch of Slivko's living quarters, bedrooms, closets, storage areas, looking for diaries, photographs, videotapes, or any item that might substantiate the illegal activities suggested by the film reels. Findings: club records, detailed logs of members, including personal data such as addresses, birthdays, and physical attributes. Investigators noticed that some records had names crossed out or annotated with cryptic references. Costumes and props. Strangely elaborate costumes for staging reenactments, including harnesses, ropes, and medical kits far beyond the scope of a typical youth club. Personal journals, handwritten notes describing experiments with fainting, oxygen deprivation, and coded references to failed attempts. These hinted at near-lethal or lethal incidents. Additionally, nothing. The search uncovered Polaroid-style photographs matching the scenes from the confiscated film footage. Some pictures showed partial sequences of a boy being hoisted, losing consciousness, then revived. Others alluded to postmortem tampering, although they were ambiguous enough not to be conclusive without cross. referencing victim identities. Interrogation tactics and psychological duels. With overwhelming circumstantial evidence in hand, authorities arrested Slivko. During initial questioning, he displayed a bizarre mix of calm politeness and outright denial. He conceded that he had filmed resuscitation drills, but vehemently refuted any claims of murder or sexual abuse. Nothing. His defense hinged on the notion that he was performing advanced training exercises to build his club members' fortitude, painting the accusations as distortions by misguided youths seeking attention. Investigators escalated their interrogation strategies, employing psychological pressure and revealing partial evidence to corner him. At times, they presented him with still frames from his own footage, challenging him to explain the unconscious states of those boys. Yet Slivko maintained his composure, offering convoluted justifications about scientific curiosity and medical exploration. Crucial confessions. After days of relentless questioning, cracks appeared in his facade. He admitted to accidents, conceding that at least 2 boys had died under his watch. He still refrained from describing them as murders, describing them instead as unfortunate mishaps. This partial confession helped investigators prove that the missing teens had indeed died in Slivko's custody. But it left a web of unaccounted vanishings. To push further, the police leveraged statements from surviving victims who recounted near-death experiences. Their consistent testimonies dismantled Slivko's narrative of consensual experiments. Gradually, he yielded more ground. He begrudgingly admitted that his methods might have been overzealous, culminating in the final admission that at least 7 boys never left his sessions alive. Searching for bodies. A grisly endeavor. One of the most harrowing aspects of the Slivko investigation involved recovering the remains of his victims. Soviet legal standards heavily emphasized physical evidence in murder cases. Therefore, law enforcement needed tangible proof. Bones, personal effects, or grave sites to corroborate Slivko's confessions. Despite his partial admissions, Slivko was initially evasive about disposal methods. Eventually, under intense questioning and possibly a desire to demonstrate cooperation, see in hopes of leniency, Slivko led investigators to secluded woodland areas. Over the course of several expeditions, he pointed out shallow graves or remote dump sites where he claimed to have concealed corpses. The remains were often skeletal, rendering identification challenging. In some instances, personal items, watch, a pendant, shoes, were found nearby, providing crucial links to police records of missing boys. Forensic challenges, decomposition. Many remains had been left in the elements for years, complicating the process of matching them to specific missing children. Fragmentation. Slivko admitted dismembering some victims to facilitate concealment, a detail that added a layer of brutality and difficulty to identification. Administrative delays. Coordinating forensic experts across multiple Soviet agencies slowed the process. Precious time was lost waiting for specialized equipment or advanced testing. Despite these difficulties, the accumulation of forensic evidence ultimately constructed a damning mosaic. Each victim's disappearance aligned with a documented training session or outing involving Slivko, bolstered by physical remains pointing to homicide. Public outrage and official reactions. News of Anatoly Slivko's crimes leaked to the public despite official attempts to manage the narrative. Soviet media coverage was typically cautious regarding stories that might tarnish the nation's image, but local whispers evolved into widespread outrage. Parents panicked, especially those whose children were or had been part of Churchid. Vigils were held for the missing boys, and impromptu protests demanded accountability. Local authorities, initially protective of Slivko, shifted to damage control. They praised the detectives who cracked the case, framing the outcome as an example of Soviet justice. However, beneath the public statements lay a stark reckoning. Why had no one intervened sooner? How could such atrocities occur in an organization meant to uplift youth? These questions circulated relentlessly, eroding public trust in officialdom. Amid the uproar, the survivors' testimonies gained renewed attention. Many discovered they weren't alone in their trauma. Support groups, informal and discreet, started forming among families and victims, offering solace and a platform for collective grievances. While Soviet society rarely provided official psychological counseling at the time, these grassroots efforts became the first step toward healing for those directly scarred by Slivko's actions. Final steps to trial, with confessions, forensic linkages, and survivor accounts, the investigators constructed a case robust enough to proceed to trial. Legal experts meticulously compiled every piece of evidence: film footage, personal diaries, victim testimonies, remains, and site photographs, into a cohesive timeline of Slivko's activities. The indictment specified multiple counts of premeditated murder, kidnapping, and sexual offenses. Even in a system notorious for swift and severe penalties, the scale of Slivko's crime stood out. In 1986, Anatoly Slivko was formally charged. The stage was set for one of the most shocking trials in Soviet criminal history. Uncertainty loomed, though about the final verdict. The Soviet Union still employed the death penalty in cases deemed extremely egregious, but not every confession automatically guaranteed such a sentence. In the next section, we will explore how the trial unfolded, the strategies employed by the prosecution and defense, and the broader social ramifications that extended far beyond the courtroom walls. Part 4: Psychological Analysis: Unraveling the Mind of Anatoly Slivko. To label Anatoly Slivko simply as a monster would be to overlook the complex interplay of personality traits, environment, and paraphilic fixations that led to his actions. Criminologists who later studied the case observed a tapestry of behaviors: narcissism, sexual sadism, obsessive-compulsive elements, and psychopathic manipulation. Threaded through all these was a potent drive for control, a theme repeatedly cited by psychologists who interviewed him after his arrest. Key questions emerged. Did Slivko's deviance stem from an innate psychopathic disorder, or did cultural and personal factors exacerbate latent tendencies? How did the Soviet environment, with its reticence to acknowledge sexual pathologies, contribute to his unbridled spree? Could more robust interventions, mental health or otherwise, have halted his descent before it claimed multiple lives? These inquiries formed the core of the psychological discourse surrounding Slivko, influencing both the trial's direction and subsequent reforms in how youth clubs were supervised. Paraphilia and sexual sadism, a complex diagnosis. One pivotal element in Slivko's case is the paraphilic disorder commonly referred to as erotic asphyxiation, or more specifically, a fixation on near-death experiences. According to forensic psychologists, Slivko appeared to derive sexual gratification from the moment of unconsciousness in his victims, phenomenon that combined elements of sadism, a pleasure from inflicting pain or humiliation, and necrophilic fantasy, a fascination with death, or the borderline between life and death. Key aspects of Slivko's paraphilia: ritualistic setup. He meticulously staged each session, selecting ropes, harnesses, and camera angles. This ritual-like approach heightened his anticipation. Emotional high: observers hypothesize that Slivko achieved an intense emotional and sexual high from dominating a victim's very life force. Video documentation. Filming sessions served dual purposes. He could relive them privately for gratification and study them as data to refine his techniques. Such paraphilias are extraordinarily rare and, in some forms, can remain non-lethal if managed with consenting adults in heavily controlled environments. However, Slivko operated under complete secrecy and targeted non-consenting minors, culminating in a lethal scenario that underlined the darkest manifestation of this psychological aberration. The role of heroic fantasy and delusions, another dimension that intrigued experts, was Slivko's self-professed heroic fantasy. He saw himself as a figure of significance, both a mentor and a discoverer of extreme human limits. This grandiose self-image seemed to obscure any moral recognition of wrongdoing. In certain interviews, Slivko painted his actions as an extension of his dedication to youth development, echoing the Soviet emphasis on forging strong, resilient citizens. He argued that these asphyxiation drills were an avant-garde form of training, akin to the severe trials of historical or legendary heroes. Of course, these rationalizations collapsed under scrutiny. No official youth program condoned near-death experiences, and the sexual subtext was inescapable. Nonetheless, it reveals how delusional thinking can coexist alongside cunning manipulation. Deception and grooming, cultivating a father figure persona. A recurring question is how Slivko managed to persuade so many adolescents to trust him with tasks that seemed, at best, terrifying and, at worst, life-threatening. Part of the answer lies in grooming, a gradual process of winning hearts and minds through benevolence, mentorship, and, at times, paternal affection, emotional bond. Many turgid members came from backgrounds lacking stable father figures. Slivko filled that void, offering praise, guidance, and the sense of belonging they yearned for. Incremental boundaries. He never jumped straight to lethal experiments. He began with mild challenges, late-night hikes, cold endurance tests, rope knots, gradually normalizing his role as an authority figure, controlling extreme scenarios. Exclusivity by designating certain members as elite. He fed teenage pride, making them feel special and chosen. This exclusivity, in turn, fostered deeper loyalty and secrecy. Such manipulative grooming tactics, combined with the era's uncritical trust in authority, created a potent cocoon around Slivko. Boys saw him as a paternal hero, not the predator he truly was. The Soviet silence, how cultural barriers enabled Slivko in dissecting Slivko's success and hiding his crimes. One must address the cultural hush surrounding sexual issues in the Soviet Union. Taboo topics: sexual orientation, paraphilias, child abuse, often went unspoken or were dismissed as Western degeneracies. This cultural reticence allowed Slivko to operate with minimal scrutiny. Healthcare gaps. Even if Slivko had sought genuine psychiatric help for his deviant urges, finding specialized treatment in smaller Soviet cities would have been nearly impossible. Lack of public awareness. Nothing. Parents taught children to obey their mentors, especially if they were seen as upstanding communitarian figures. The notion of a youth leader exploiting or sexually harming minors rarely entered mainstream discourse. Fear of scandal. Local authorities preferred to keep potential sex crimes quiet. Publicly acknowledging such atrocities contradicted the image of a morally upright socialist society. These facets formed a system-wide blind spot that Slivko ruthlessly exploited. His case became a catalyst for belated discussions about sexual abuse, psychological disorders, and the fragility of youth organizations left unchecked. The forensic psychologist's verdict. After Slivko's arrest, a panel of forensic psychologists conducted extensive evaluations. They concluded that while he displayed severe pathological traits, he was sane enough to stand trial. He exhibited no debilitating psychosis, no voices, hallucinations, or illusions preventing him from discerning right from wrong. Instead, his moral compass was selectively negated by his violent paraphilia and meticulously cultivated justifications. Key observations from experts' responsibility. Slivko understood the illegality and immorality of his actions, evidenced by elaborate cover-ups. Manipulation. His ability to orchestrate complex deceptions signaled high cognitive functioning. Absence of remorse. While he showed moments of distress, they appeared more rooted in fear of exposure than empathy for victims. These findings proved pivotal in the upcoming trial. Legally, they undermined any potential insanity defense and underscored the argument for maximum punishment under Soviet law. Tally of trauma. The survivor's perspective, the psychological toll on survivors cannot be overstated. Most were haunted by nightmares, flashbacks, and profound trust issues. Many endured feelings of guilt, haunted by the question, could I have saved others by speaking out sooner? In a culture with limited mental health resources, the road to recovery was daunting. Survivors also faced social stigma. Some found themselves ostracized by neighbors or coworkers who didn't know how to process the revelations. Others kept their experiences secret for decades, fearing that delving into those memories would invite further emotional turmoil or social judgment. Despite these challenges, a handful of survivors found solidarity in each other. Mutual understanding, even if based on a tragic link, offered some measure of healing. Over time, their willingness to testify, to share their stories, and to demand accountability became a cornerstone of the criminal case, as well as a symbol of resilience in the face of unspeakable crimes. Impact on Soviet youth programs. The downfall of Anatoly Slivko sparked sweeping reforms in how youth programs were monitored. The Ministry of Education, in collaboration with local governments, rolled out stricter protocols. Background checks. Potential youth leaders now underwent more rigorous scrutiny, including references from multiple sources and interviews with families. Mandatory oversight. Unannounced inspections of youth clubs aimed to ensure that their activities aligned with stated educational goals. Parent councils clubs were encouraged to form parent committees, granting mothers and fathers a say in planned outings, safety protocols, and supervision standards. While these measures came too late for Slivko's victims, nothing. They represented a collective acknowledgement that youth mentorship, once seen as purely benevolent, could harbor dark corners if left unchecked. Experts credit the case with opening reluctant eyes to the necessity of child protection structures even within a socialist framework. Nothing. Evaluating the efficacy of Soviet justice, the Slivko investigation also raised broader queries about the Soviet legal apparatus. On one hand, the eventual trial demonstrated that the state could, when pressed, marshal considerable resources to address violent crime. On the other hand, the delayed response pointed to systemic inertia and an underlying fear of scandal. Critics argued that had local policing been more proactive, or had parents found an open channel to raise suspicions earlier, several young lives might have been spared. This tension illuminated the complexities of Soviet governance. The same robust enforcement that swiftly punished dissent could be sluggish and disorganized in mundane criminal matters. Moreover, the centralized control of information often hindered the free flow of warnings or suspect profiles between regions. As the Slivko case gained notoriety, these contradictions became an integral part of public discourse, fueling debates about transparency, community oversight, and the boundaries of state authority. A legacy of fear and reflection by the mid-1980s, as the Soviet Union edged toward eventual reform, the Slivko case stood as a chilling testament to humanity's darkest capacities. Even within a system that prided itself on collective moral values, parents became more vigilant, youth programs more regulated, and the taboo around sexual and psychological abuse began to erode, albeit slowly. For years to come, criminologists would cite Slivko's name as a prime example of a serial killer with a double life, the beloved mentor who was secretly a manipulative sadist. The psychological autopsies performed on his actions offered insight into how deception, institutional naivety, and individual pathology can merge into a perfect storm of predation. Yet, for all the reforms and reflections, Nothing could undo the violence visited upon those who lost their lives or those who lived on with indelible scars. The question of whether this tragedy could have been averted earlier remains a poignant reminder of how crucial vigilance, transparency, and empathy are in safeguarding the vulnerable. In the next section, we will explore the trial's drama, its verdict, and the final chapter of Anatoly Slivko's life. A moment that brought a measure of justice, if not solace, to the victims and their families. Part Fight Tree, the end. Anatoly Slivko faced trial in 1986, a spectacle that riveted the entire Soviet Union. Evidence of his crimes, meticulous logs, graphic film reels, and buried remains left little room for doubt. Survivors bravely recounted their ordeals, describing a man who wore the mask of a father figure while orchestrating horrors that defied all moral comprehension. The once celebrated youth leader was unmasked as a manipulative killer who preyed upon the most vulnerable. Throughout proceedings, Slivko tried to justify his deeds as scientific experiments or educational drills gone awry, but no argument could overshadow the sheer brutality captured in his own recordings. Ultimately, the court found him guilty of multiple counts of murder, sexual abuse, and other charges. He was sentenced to death, a rare but fitting verdict in a system capable of exacting extreme penalties for especially heinous crimes. For the people of Nevinomysk and beyond, nothing. The conclusion to Slivko's case was both a relief and a profound shock to the collective conscience. It illustrated that evil can hide in plain sight, shielded by benevolent reputations and institutional blind spots. Families of the victims and survivors, though never fully healed, gained a measure of closure. Meanwhile, Soviet authorities introduced new monitoring practices for youth groups striving, perhaps belatedly, to ensure that no similar monster could exploit the system's weaknesses. Today, the name Anatoly Slivko remains a grim reminder of the fragile boundary between guidance and exploitation, between trust and betrayal. His story underscores the importance of open dialogue, vigilant parenting, and transparent institutions. As we turn the page on this unsettling chapter of history, may it serve as a cautionary tale, urging us to protect those who look to mentors for growth and safety, lest they fall into the hands of a predator wearing a mentor's gentle smile.